Welcome to Off Panel.
Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of the Eisner and Harvey Award-winning graphic novel, The Fifth Beatle. It's Vivek Tiwary. Thanks for coming on, Vivek.
Thanks for having me, David.
So I wanted to start this conversation about The Fifth Beatle in the beginning for you. And one of the things I find to be most fascinating about this book is, The Fifth Beatle, this graphic novel, which just had its first paperback version come out for the first time, is, near as I can tell, the very first comic you ever did, which kind of blows my mind because how accomplished it is. Is that the case? Was that your first comic?
It was indeed. It was indeed. I mean, I've been reading comics since I was a little kid. I often say that I probably learned to read by reading comics. Mm-hmm. Literally, my earliest memories of reading are reading Tintin books with my mom. Mm-hmm. So I've certainly been very familiar with the comics medium. And I was also one of those sort of fanboy geeks that would always purchase the extended edition of books that included scripts. And so I had compared scripts to final works and, was also familiar and comfortable with comic scripts. Mm-hmm. But the simple answer to your question is absolutely. It was my first attempt at writing a comic script and producing a graphic novel. So yeah, it was very much my first.
So you weren't just like a fan, you actually took interest into like kind of the craft behind it because you were reading scripts and kind of like looking at the mechanics of how they work and everything.
For sure. I mean, I tend to be a pretty academic, geeky person in general. And so whenever there's something that I really enjoy or I'm really passionate about, I always want to know the inner workings of that thing. How was that book written? What was its inspiration? How did that movie get made? How did they design that Broadway musical? I'm always interested in the inner workings of things, which is, in large part how I came to the Brian Epstein story, being curious about the inner workings of the business of the Beatles. Mm-hmm. So yes, when it comes to comics, I was definitely growing up always fascinated by how they were made and who were the creators. And so I did approach it sort of in that studious way, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So for listeners who don't know, The Fifth Beatle is the story of Brian Epstein, who you mentioned already, and he's the titular person who was the Beatles manager who helped them find success and to become eventually, as he emphasized many times in the book himself, bigger than Elvis. In the afterword of the hardcover, you talk about how you first discovered this story, or his story, Brian's story, when you were at the Wharton School of Business more than 20 years ago. I have to ask, as somebody who, you've always been, you're kind of an academic, you're interested in the inner workings of everything. What was it that spoke to you so much about Brian's story, as a person and as somebody who likes to create things themselves?
So, I came to Brian's story when I was at Wharton. As you pointed out, it was 1991, and I was on a track to join my family business, which would have seen me selling food products or financial securities, neither of which I was particularly interested in. I was passionate about the arts and entertainment industries. And unfortunately, in 1991, Wharton didn't have any resources for students who were interested in those industries. On a side note, that's changed. Wharton has a lot of resources for students who are interested in media and the arts and entertainment. I hope I'm one of those resources. I go back and guest lecture and do quite a bit of that. But in 1991, they just didn't. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of left on my own. If I wanted to learn about the business of the arts, I had to kind of study it on my own. And being a lifelong Beatles fan, who believed that the Beatles and Brian Epstein, their manager, kind of wrote and then rewrote the rules of the pop music business, I thought I should study the life of Brian Epstein. And I was initially interested in all those Beatles stories. I was a Beatles fan and I was a business student. So I wanted to know the business of the Beatles. How did he get them a record deal and convince George Martin to sign and produce the band when every single record company and producer in the United Kingdom had passed on them? How did he come up with the suits and the haircuts? I knew from knowing my history that a British band had never made an impact in the United States before the Beatles. So how did Brian convince Ed Sullivan to take a chance on the Beatles and book the band on U.S. television? How did he convince the record labels to put out Sgt. Pepper's with all its unusual instrumentation and its, at the time, quite radical album cover? Mm-hmm. These were the stories that I was chasing. And as I uncovered those stories, I was richly rewarded with these fascinating, inspiring business stories, and I was a business student. And I know this is a long answer to your question, but
No,
to finally get to the heart of the answer to your question, interestingly enough, as much as those business stories inspired me, and that's what I was chasing, what I ended up uncovering that I wasn't even looking for was the human side of his story.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that Brian was gay at a time where it was literally against the law. It was a felony to be gay in the United Kingdom in the 1960s. He was Jewish at a time of pervasive anti-Semitism, and at a time where Jews just did not work extensively in the music business, especially not in the United Kingdom. Obviously, that's changed, but that was the situation back then. And finally, he was from Liverpool. Mm-hmm. And Liverpool, prior to the Beatles, is not a town that has any cultural influence whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And to top it off, he was 26 years old. So he was a gay Jewish kid running around a dirty port town in the north of England saying, I found a local rock and roll band who are going to be bigger than Elvis, mm-hmm. who with my help are going to elevate pop music into an art form. Mm-hmm. And this is what I found so inspiring. People laughed at him. They said, those dreams are crazy, and people like you don't do things like that.
Right.
And as a young a kid of Indian origin who was, expected to either become a doctor or an engineer or join his family business, but I wanted to write comic books and produce Broadway musicals, that story was so inspiring. I thought if the gay Jewish kid from Liverpool could bring the world the Beatles, then why couldn't the weirdo Indian kid from New York's Lower East Side not be a doctor or an engineer, but be a comic book author and a Broadway producer? Mm-hmm. I always say that learning the human struggles of Brian's life filled me with inspiration, and that the message of the Brian Epstein story is that no dream is too impossible and no person too unlikely to realize that dream. Mm-hmm. And I know that's a very long answer to your question, but that's really the heart of what drew me deeply into the Brian Epstein story. I might have come in through the Beatles, mm-hmm. but I stuck with it. I've been researching his life for 25 years, since 1991. And the reason I've been doing that for so long is because of this human story that I uncovered.
Yeah, and that was the thing that I thought was the most amazing is I had actually heard of him before the Fifth Beatle, not a lot, but it was kind of like in the grand scheme of like a casual Beatles fan, Brian Epstein is not like something that's like right at the top of the list of things you learn about. He was in. I'm not saying this is actually the case, but in some ways he was kind of like relegated to like a footnote in history for like the casual music audience. And the amazing thing is like, as you reveal in the Fifth Beatle, is he was a visionary, and he was a visionary who had an interesting dichotomy in the sense that he had this brilliant idea as to how to bring this music to the world, but he wasn't able to bring himself to the world. And it's what makes it such a fascinating and a powerful story, is the fact that the human drama behind it, the fact that he couldn't be himself, despite the fact that he could bring so much love and life to the world through these people that he saw so much in. I mean, it's really fascinating. But one of the things I really love about, like, I've read a bunch of interviews with you, and you often call Brian your historical mentor, which I think is a fantastic phrase.
Thank you. Yeah, so, Brian died in 1967, and I was born in 1973, mm-hmm. so I never had the opportunity to meet him. Yeah. But I've studied his life meticulously as a template for what to learn, not just what to do, but what not to do. And I think that's what a mentoring relationship is like. A mentor is somebody that you learn and you listen to and learn from acutely, both what to do and what not to do. I think mentors are always human beings, mm-hmm. And you learn from both their successes and their failures. You learn from their points of inspiration as well as from their misgivings. And that's what I really tried to do with Brian. And, I always say that when I was, at the Wharton School in 1991, and I was unable to find a teacher in the field that I was interested in, and I couldn't find a living, breathing mentor to guide me, so I turned to history. Mm-hmm. And in Brian Epstein, I found a mentor. And so that's why I call him my historical mentor. And I often do talks and give lectures and whatnot to young people, and oftentimes I'll meet young folks who have particular dreams or passions, and they complain that in the town where I live or the resources that I have, there's I can't find a teacher, or I can't find a mentor, or I can't find any sort of guidance, and my family doesn't have any connections in this industry, or whatever it might be. And I always tell them, like, then turn to history.
Yeah.
You have no excuse not to find yourself a historical mentor.
Mm-hmm.
The history of humankind is so rich with inspiration. You just need to mine it. And I can't tell you who your historical mentor should be, but if you're interested in pursuing social work or a form of politics, and you say there's no one of my ethnicity who can assist me, or my folks from my background and my ethnicity usually don't excel in this arm of politics, then maybe you need to intricately study the life of Abraham Lincoln,
mm-hmm.
Where you'll learn that he ran for office 4 times and lost. And everybody told him, you'll never get elected. Your ideas are too crazy, or they're too radical, and people aren't, you don't have enough followers. And he stuck with his dreams with passion and persistence. And, we're on the eve of an election in the U.S. today. And Lincoln's probably the greatest Republican president of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And as a person of color, I'm incredibly glad he stuck with it. An incredibly inspiring story. If you're a young woman who's interested in pursuing a sport, and in your local town, women don't pursue that form of athletics, or there's no league or no one to help you, then maybe you should study the life of Amelia Earhart, mm-hmm. Who was told that women can't fly, and she proved that women could in fact soar, both literally and figuratively. Mm-hmm. This idea of the historical mentor is really there for the taking, and I will say, especially in a day and era like today, where we have, to use a cliched phrase, the information superhighway. When I did this research in 1991, there was no Wikipedia, there was no YouTube, there was no Google, there were none of these online resources that we so take for granted today. And for young people to find a historical mentor, the beginning of your journey is so much easier than it was for me. Although I would very much caution or point or encourage, or what, I don't know what the exact phrase is, folks who want to find a historical mentor, I need to really drive home the fact that historical mentors, you have to dig deep.
Yeah.
It's not about just reading a Wikipedia article or looking at a couple of YouTube videos and saying, okay, that was inspiring, he's my historical mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth is, if I had those resources when I was doing my Brian Epstein studies, I might have stopped. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, I was interested in the business of the Beatles. I might have read a Wikipedia article, looked at a couple of interviews that Brian gave, and thought, okay, I've learned what I wanted to learn, and now I'm done. But because I didn't have the ability to just read a couple of articles and look at a couple of videos, I ended up needing to dig really deep and call people and do interviews with people who knew him. And by sort of forcing myself, because I had no choice, to do that kind of research, I wound up uncovering a story that I wasn't chasing, the story of his personal life. So I do also I want to caution young people that with all the information that's so readily available today, yes, it means that your journey is easier at the beginning, but it's not going to be any easier over the long haul, because you need to do more than just look at a couple of websites in order to find yourself a historical mentor.
And you have to want it. You have to have that drive to look further than just that, initial webpage that shows up in Google. It has to be more in depth than that. But I actually do think it's interesting, the concept of historical mentor, if only from the comics standpoint, because comics is an industry that is long. You look at the artists of today, and they're influenced by people like Jack Kirby and Alex Toth, and I'm totally losing names for some reason, Mobius, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many historical mentors, people that a lot of artists have never met, yet they see their work and they read their writing and they read their tips and they read all these different things that they've said about the best way to craft a comic book story. And they have to find inspiration from the legends that led before them, and it's more than just looking at the work. I know a lot of comic artists actually read up on the perspectives that they had in old interviews in the Comics Journal and things like that, and it's really interesting because like I really do think historical mentor is a very comic friendly concept, especially given the way that like future or previous generations always, you know, kind of foster the later generations even without those two sides meeting.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to ask about the development of the Fifth Beatle because, you know, obviously, like you're clearly passionate about Brian's story. It was a thing that was a big driver for you personally. But what made you want to not just learn it yourself, but share it with everyone else?
I mean, really, it was just the this incredible shift that the Brian Epstein story caused in my life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as I said, I'm a first generation American. My parents were immigrants. My family's originally of Indian origin. And what young people of Indian origin like myself are expected to do if they have some means and opportunity are to become doctors or engineers or study fields like technology. You know, and the Brian Epstein story really inspired me to chase my dreams and to pursue my passions. And it's such a human story. I mean, it's really the ultimate underdog story. You know, we talk about adapting the Fifth Beatle. We're right now adapting it. I'm saying I shouldn't say talking about. We are currently adapting the Fifth Beatle to television. We're turning it into a television miniseries.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, when I talk about what it will look like on the screen, you know, I rarely turn to music biopics, and I instead turn to films like Rocky or Billy Elliot. You know, these inspiring human stories. And I point out that, like, you don't need to be a great fan of boxing to appreciate the Rocky movies.
Right.
You certainly don't need to be a fan of Billy Elliot, of a ballet, to appreciate Billy Elliot. And in the same way, you know, you don't need to be a fan of music to be inspired by the Brian Epstein story. It is a universal story that everyone all around the world can relate to. This concept of having a dream and feeling like your dreams might be difficult or unorthodox or hard to achieve and needing some inspiration to chase those dreams. You know, I feel that's something every human being all over the world could relate to. And that's why I wanted to share it with people in the hopes that it will inspire others in sort of the same way that it inspired me. Mm-hmm. You know, I believe that Brian saw in the Beatles a band that had a great message of love to share with the world. Mm-hmm. And as a gay man who in the 1960s had to literally, to use a Beatles lyric, hide his own love away, mm-hmm. you know, he thought it was a very worthy life to dedicate himself to helping the Beatles spread that message around the world, right. Because it's a message the entire world needed and could benefit from. And I guess not unlike Brian in his desire to spread the Beatles' message around the world, you know, I have a desire to spread Brian's message around the world, because this message of chasing the seemingly impossible dream and being able to realize it with passion and persistence and bring wonderful things into the world as a result of that is a message that I think everyone should hear. Mm-hmm. And that's really my motivation here.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious, what made, you know, you said it's being adapted into a TV series as well, but I'm curious, like, what made comics the right medium to bring it to life in, at least initially?
So, you know, when I decided that I wanted to tell the Brian Epstein story, it was about a decade ago that I started working on the Fifth Beatle, you know, as a project. You know, as we said earlier in this conversation, I started researching Brian's life 25 years ago right. for personal interest. You know, I wasn't writing a screenplay. I wasn't writing a graphic novel. I wasn't even writing a term paper. It wasn't for a Wharton class. It was just something that I did for personal inspiration. But about a decade ago, I had finished producing A Raisin in the Sun on Broadway, and I was looking for my next project. And as proud as I was of Raisin in the Sun, it's a revival of a classic piece of African American literature. And I thought, my next project, I'd like to tell a new story, and a story that hasn't been told before. Mm-hmm. And I realized that it was the Brian Epstein story, this story that at the time I'd been carrying around for 15 years. No one else had told the story before. And, you know, when I started, started researching it. I was just a kid with passion. And at that point in my life, you know, I was all of a sudden no longer a kid and a student. I was a respected producer. I had won some Tony Awards. I had a good reputation in the industry. And I thought, I can really do this. You know, if no one else has done it before, you know, why not me? Mm-hmm. I have the ability, I have the passion, and I have the network that I could actually pull this thing off. So that's when I decided it was time to tell the story. And I'm a believer that you need to figure out what is the story you want to tell and how do you want to tell it, and then decide on the medium last. Figure out the story first and the medium last. And that's kind of why, if you look at my career, you've seen it, you'll probably see I've moved around a lot. I've done film, I've done TV, I've done Broadway, I've done graphic novels. I mean, certainly Broadway is the medium that I've spent the most time in. But I've worked in so many different fields, and on paper it can look a little random, a little unfocused. But I like to think the general focus is that I'm a storyteller, and that I take the story where the medium best fits the story. So I started to think, how do I want to tell the Brian Epstein story? How do I want to structure this? And some early decisions I made were that I was going to focus on the time he spent with the Beatles, hence the title, The Fifth Beatle. And so, through exposition and flashbacks and dream sequences, we learn about his past and we learn about his childhood. We learn what makes him tick. But it really focuses on the time he spends with the Beatles. So with that in mind, it starts off in 1961 Liverpool, which is dark, gray, drab, a little industrial, a little depressing. In my head, I viewed that as being poetically very black and white. And the story ends in 1967 London. Now, 1967 London is the summer of love. It's the dawn of the psychedelic era. There's literally an event in the UK that year called the Technicolor Dream. So in my mind, as a creator, as an artist, I felt the arc of the Brian Epstein story mirrors the arc of the movement from black and white to color. Now, that might not make sense to anyone other than me, but you can at least tell that I was thinking in terms of color palette. And I believe that the two media that most powerfully use color as a narrative tool are graphic novels and film or television, sort of, the camera, the moving camera, if you will. And so I decided right off the bat, 10 years ago, The Fifth Beatle needs to be both a graphic novel and a film. My initial thought was film. And without wanting to go off on too much of a tangent, the television industry, anyone who watches television will know that the past decade has seen radical changes in the television industry.
It's peak TV.
Totally. I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think television would have considered doing something like The Fifth Beatle. And with no respect to the TV industry, 10 years ago, the kind of talent that I was chasing wouldn't have considered doing TV. I don't think anyone would argue that, House of Cards, Kevin Spacey and David Fincher, they wouldn't have considered television 10 years ago. But obviously now they're trailblazers in TV. And so initially I was looking at film. Fast forward to where we are now, and I grew up also watching miniseries. I'm a big sci-fi geek, and V the Final Battle were big series for me growing up. And 5-10 years ago, you didn't see a lot of miniseries and event series. That format had kind of disappeared in America. But in the past 5-10 years or so, you're really seeing much more of that. And now they don't even call them miniseries; they call them event series. And so the idea of having a 6-hour canvas was very exciting to me. So initially, as I said, I looked at graphic novels and films because I felt those are the two media that most powerfully use color as a narrative tool. And recently, we've shifted from film to television because television will just give us a bigger canvas. Film is an hour and a half to 2 hours, and television gives us a 6-hour canvas. And also, what we call in America an event series, 5 or 6 hours of episodes, in the UK is a season, and they call them series in the UK, but a season of television in the UK is 6 episodes, 6 hours. So it's also a sweet spot of time. This sort of 6 1-hour episodes is sort of a sweet spot both in the US and in the UK. And obviously this is a very British story. So that also made a lot of sense for us. But it really goes back to this idea of color palette, and it is a bit of a misperception to think that we thought, let's do a graphic novel, and then in the wake of the success of the graphic novel, we decided, okay, now let's do a film. It really, from the very beginning, I thought of both. That being said, the graphic novel took on a life of its own. I got 2 wonderful artists attached, and we were off to the races. And The film was, as films and television shows do, they're a lot more complicated. There's a lot more people involved, a lot more money involved. And so it just became clear at one point that the graphic novel was going to happen first. And so I focused my energies there. But the truth of the matter is, really from the very beginning, we thought of doing both.
Yeah, well, in comics, comics have a very complicated relationship with adaptations. It's like everybody wants like the option money, so to speak, but there's also like a cynical nature to a lot of like fans that they're like, they look at something, I'm not saying this is the case for the Fifth Beatle, but they'll look at the Fifth Beatle and they're like, oh, this comic or this graphic novel comes out, and then next thing you know, they hear news about it being adapted, and they're like, oh, it's just a storyboard. But I mean, this is in a lot of ways literally the story of your life. I mean, this is a 25-year journey for you to not only learn his story and like be inspired by his story, but to tell his story. And it's, I don't know. I mean, I think you're pretty in the safe when it comes to the that cynical nature of conflating graphic novels as storyboards, especially considering the fact that like, with the 6-hour time frame, I'm sure you're going to be able to touch on a lot of different things that you weren't able to in the graphic novel.
Absolutely, and that's you're hitting on something that is a hugely exciting thing for me. With the television show, there's two things that are key. One is that we have secured access to Beatles music. Mm-hmm. The band has signed off on the project, so that's awesome. Which is a huge coup. And so we have access to Beatles music, which is unprecedented and wonderful. And a graphic novel, I believe that Andrew and Kyle, or my two artists, did work that you can almost hear the music bursting out of the pages.
Absolutely.
But obviously you can't. You can't. Maybe one day books will be digital and fully integrated with soundtracks, but not yet. And so today, the books poetically sing, but they don't actually sing. Mm. So in the television show, they really are. We'll be able to have a lot more music sequences. In the book, we only had a few because I didn't want pages and pages of bands performing and you can't actually hear the music. So that's one thing that I'm really excited to have a lot more of those moments in the television show. But the other thing is this thing you're getting out of putting my research to use, having the space to tell a much bigger story. One of the things that was was a decision I made in the very early days with the graphic novel is that I wanted the graphic novel to be thin. Mm-hmm. I wanted it to be not much more than 120 pages. I figured it's about a minute a page if you're looking at the artwork carefully. So I want this experience to be about a 2-hour read.
Sure.
I want you to feel like you could pick up this book and read it before your flight lands. Whatever plane, if you're on an airplane flight, no matter how short the flight is, there's a good chance you could read this thing before your flight lands. And I wanted people who weren't hardcore Beatles fans or hardcore comic book fans to pick it up, flip through it, see that the artwork is beautiful. Andrew and Kyle did breathtaking work on this. Let's take myself out of the equation. You're just flipping through it at a bookstore and you see the art's gorgeous. We just put it out in an expanded edition paperback that's literally its cover price is $14.99, so it's not that expensive. You might not be a huge Beatles fan, you might not be a big comic fan, but you could finish this book in 2 hours. It's like going to the movies. The story sounds intriguing. You might just give it a chance. Mm-hmm. You might just give it a shot. That's the audience I really wanted to reach. As we talked earlier about my desire to share this story with the entire world. Like I didn't want to just share this with Beatles fans or with comic book fans, and I thought that a thin graphic novel could have achieved that. Mm-hmm. And I'm proud to say we have achieved that. It's been translated into a ton of foreign languages and won all these awards and is #1 New York Times bestseller. It's been really quite gratifying. But now that we've done all that, now is the time to take all this research that I've accumulated and tell all the story, or not all the stories, but many of the stories. Mm-hmm. And to me, that 6-hour canvas will really allow me to do that.
Yeah.
When I only have a minute to say what I'm doing, I say we're adapting the graphic novel to television because it's an easy way to explain it. But now that you and I are able to have a more in-depth chat, I will say it's not an adaptation, it's an expansion.
Yeah.
It's getting into to elements of the story that I couldn't tell in the graphic novel. Pete Best, the first Beatles drummer, or the Beatles drummer at the beginning of this story, Brian Epstein had to fire Pete Best. It's one of the things Brian had to do as his first tasks as manager. And obviously Pete was replaced by Ringo Starr, and the rest is history. Mm-hmm. And I think that telling the Beatles story without the Pete Best story would be irresponsible. telling the Brian Epstein story without Pete Best, maybe not irresponsible.
Right.
I'm not sure we made the right decision, but we decided we're not going to tell the Pete Best story in the graphic novel. Mm-hmm. I can tell you right now, Pete Best is a large part of the pilot episode.
Yeah.
And I'm incredibly excited about that. Brian's relationship with his parents is such a rich and complicated relationship. They knew that he was gay. His mother was his best friend and closest confidant. On the personal family side, she was very supportive. His father also loved him very dearly, but didn't totally understand. He wasn't ashamed or upset that Brian was gay, but he didn't totally understand it, you know. And so that there's complications there. And I decided the book is the Fifth Beatle. We're going to focus on Brian's work with the Beatles. His family life is important, but it's not going to be a driving factor of the story. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I made the right decision there, but it was a decision I had to make if I was going to keep it to 120 pages.
Yeah.
But now that I've got 6 hours, Brian's relationship with his family is going to be a rich and deep part of the story. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, you know, with and it's another difference between film and television. You know, in film. You know, if we're only having 2 hours, you can't really get into what they call minor characters, so to speak. You know, it's sort of screenwriting 101. It's not acceptable to have a major character, you know, in the first half an hour of a project that disappears and you don't hear from later unless a character dies. Right. You know, whereas in the television event series format, not only is that totally acceptable, it's normal. You know, you might have a lead character that's in the first couple of episodes that doesn't appear at all in the next few episodes. You know, Mildred Pierce was a wonderful HBO miniseries, and Evan Rachel Wood, I believe she won the award for her work in Mildred Pierce, and if my memory is correct, she doesn't even appear in the first 3 episodes. Yeah. You know, so you can sort of do that in television. So this way we get to characters like Pete Best, who I mentioned, or John Lennon's Aunt Mimi. You know, there are a number of wonderful people who crossed paths with Brian and were so important to the Beatles' history and so impactful on Brian and what he did, you know, in his life, but maybe weren't consistently there the whole time.
Yeah.
And this format, this 6-hour format, will really allow us to get into those stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk about the graphic novel for a bit, specifically for the art, because I'm a gigantic Andrew Robinson fan, and he that's one of the interesting things about him is like,
me too.
I actually can't really think of very many projects besides this that he has done significant interior work on. I mean, he's
that's right.
He's such an incredible artist. But I mean, for like the Fifth Beatle, you know, I read that he fully painted it, and I read that it took him about 4 years to do, which is
that's
incredible.
Right.
But I wanted to ask, because for me, it's hard to imagine finding a better fit for the bulk of the story than Andrew, because he's so great at bringing likenesses to life without taking the energy out of it. Like, there's so much life and energy, and like you know, you said you can't actually have the music on the pages, but it feels musical. There's music to the art, and that was one of the questions I have is what made 2 questions actually. How did you first line up with Andrew? And second off, what made him the right fit for the book?
So I met Andrew through his agent at the time, a gentleman named Mark Irwin, who is a very well-respected creator in the comic industry himself. He does a lot of inking work. He's wonderful. And he was Andrew's agent at the time. And when through mutual friends, I had met Mark, and Mark had suggested Andrew. As a huge comic geek, I certainly knew who Andrew was through his work, and I knew that he would be brilliant. So I thought, gosh, Andrew would be amazing for the Fifth Beatle. And so then I sat down with him, and very immediately it was clear that Andrew understood the story, and that to me was the most important thing. He understood that yes, on the surface it's a Beatles story, and immediately artists were interested because it was a chance to draw the Beatles, and that's very exciting. But Andrew sort of understood that yes, it's a Beatles story on the surface, but it's really the story about this guy, about this underdog, this gay Jewish kid from Liverpool, and Andrew was very inspired by that in the same way that I was inspired by that. And so it was clear that Andrew sort of emotionally and spiritually understood what I was trying to achieve with the Fifth Beatle, and that's really what made him perfect for it. So I was very fortunate that Andrew was sort of my top choice for the book, and literally the first artist I went out to, and it worked out. He was intrigued by the idea of the project because it was Beatles related. He read the script and immediately understood that it was Brian's story. And then he sat down with me and we hit it off and realized we were going to be able to do wonderful things with this. So that's how it came to pass with Andrew. Kyle Baker is the other artist I worked with on the book. And Andrew, as you know, drew or painted, I should say, the lion's share of the book. Kyle does an isolated 7-page sequence called Chaos in the Philippines.
That is a very accurate description of what happens.
Yeah, right. And, it's a sequence that pays homage to the old Beatles cartoons of the 1960s, not the Yellow Submarine film, but the television show that were very goofy and silly and kind of a template for the Monkees TV show that, sort of followed in its wake. And I wanted, this comes, Chaos in the Philippines comes at a time in which the Beatles go over to the Philippines. It's unprecedented that they're doing this crazy world tour. So they go over to the Philippines. They inadvertently snub Imelda Marcos. She pulls their security. They end up getting chased out of the country. There are riots in the country. They barely make it out. As soon as they got out and they thought, phew, we've made it out. We're safe. They land in the UK and they hear they're burning Beatles records in America because John Lennon had said that Beatles were going to be bigger than Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So it's this weird period in the Beatles' career where everything, in my mind as a creator, poetically, I thought everything went cartoony. Mm-hmm. So I thought, if that's kind of what happens, if everything went cartoony, then let's do it like a cartoon, And I really wanted this to feel almost like, and we interrupt our regular programming with, and we stuck in like an insert, And I feel Andrew Robinson is incredibly talented. He could do anything, but I really wanted this to feel like such an abrupt change that I thought, let's hire another artist. So it really feels like all of a sudden, whoa, where did this come from? And it's like a little comic insert in the middle of an otherwise beautiful, very photorealistic kind of work. And so I knew I wanted to do something cartoony, and I knew I wanted a separate artist. And, Kyle Baker is, one of our industry's greatest cartoonists. He's won every award to prove it, and multiple times over. And Kyle is a New Yorker. He and I have known each other for years. We've moved in similar circles. We're friends now. We weren't friends before, but we were friendly. We had mutual acquaintances. And Kyle's a little bit older than me, and I just had an instinct. I was like, I bet Kyle probably grew up with the Beatles and possibly grew up with those Beatles cartoons. Mm-hmm. And we've met on a number of occasions. We've talked about wanting to find a project to do together. This might just be the one, and God, wouldn't he be amazing? And so I reached out to him, and I was right on all counts. He had never done he had grown up working, loving the Beatles, listening to their music. He said the first song that he ever learned by heart as a little kid and was singing was Obladi Oblada. He said he grew up with those Beatles cartoons, and he read my script and loved it and said, I'd love to do this. This is the project that we've been looking for together, and let's do it. So again, with Kyle, I got incredibly fortunate that the first artist my top choice and the first guy I went out to immediately wanted to do it. So that's how Kyle came to the project. And all of a sudden I was off to the races with two incredibly well-respected, top of their game artists who were literally my top two choices. So I was very, very fortunate and humbled to be able to proceed with the Fifth Beatle in that way.
I have to give you a lot of credit. It's still astounding to me that this was your first comic, because a lot of people are trying to break into comics. Not saying that you were trying to, because you have such a rich history in the past and everything. It seems like you kind of picked up on the medium really well, and like you had you had a very, very specific vision on how you wanted it to be rendered visually. Like, you knew that you wanted the Philippine section to be more cartoony. You knew that you wanted Andrew's section to be much more realistic because of the nature of the story. And I was curious if you think that your past in other visual mediums may have helped have a limited learning curve.
Yes. To answer your question, there's no doubt in my mind that my background in theater and in the visual performing arts, had a massive influence on how I approached the script and how I was able to talk to my two artists. Through my work in theater, I was very, very comfortable with how scenes are blocked, and the performing arts in general, things like lighting design and costume design. And this is the kind of language you use when talking to artists of the caliber of Andrew and Kyle. You sort of say, I imagine this sequence lit in this way or shot from this angle. Mm-hmm. And I think the book is very filmic in its feel, and that's certainly borne through by both the talent of the artists as well as kind of the direction that I gave them. But I also want to be very very clear and sort of also give credit where it's due that my script was an odd beast. There were moments where I very specifically knew what I wanted, and I was able to describe it in those theater terms because I came out of Broadway, and to say, like, here's this sequence, I want it to look like this, I want it to feel like this, I want to use this color palette, I want to use this sort of camera angle for the shot, I want the page broken down into 4 panels and one big panel with 3 inserts, and here's photo references for the architecture, and here's photo references for the costume design that I want the characters to be wearing, and here's what they're going through, emotionally, and like sort of directing the actors in that sense, using all my sort of theater background to kind of orchestrate that scene. And, a super talented artist like Andrew or Kyle, they might have some comments. They might say, I gotcha, but how about we try this? But they could, I knew they could listen to what I was saying and give me exactly what I wanted. Mm-hmm. However, to be fair to them and to give them their due credit, there were other sequences where I had no idea how to do it in art, mm-hmm. And I said, here's the dialogue, here's what the characters are going through emotionally. But you tell me what's the best way to do it in art and in sequential art, to use the pretentious comic book phrase. Mm-hmm. And they would get back to me and say, here's how I think we should do it, because in my mind, in theater and in television, sometimes you do have these long sequences where it's just 2 characters talking to each other. In television, they call it the walk and talk. The 2 characters from Law and Order walking outside the courtroom, walking down the New York City streets. They pass a hot dog vendor. There's characters behind them. And it's really just an excuse to have one long conversation.
It's Aaron Sorkin.
Totally, right? You can do this in television. Mm-hmm. Not so easy to do in graphic novels. Right. You can't just have the same background or a slightly changing background for pages and pages while 2 characters are just talking. So, those were moments where my theater background and my television background, allowed me to get into the emotions and the lighting and that sort of thing. But I wasn't really sure how to set the stage, so to speak. And in those moments, Andrew and Kyle, just because they're so incredibly talented, were able to take the ball and run with it and come back to me and say, here's how I think we should do it. Here's where we set it. Here's how we change things. So it really was a fascinating collaboration. And, for those of your listeners who are involved in the comic industry, and especially for those who aren't, you'll know that in comics, scripts really do take all sorts of different formats. I've been told that Alan Moore's scripts are very, very detailed. He knows exactly what he wants. And I've read some other scripts by other writers who have no idea about the art and don't care. And they say, here's the dialogue, and you figure out how to do the art. And, my script was really somewhere, it was a mixture of both. I wouldn't even say it was somewhere in between, because it's more that, because it wasn't in between. It was both extremes. Mm-hmm. There were moments of full control where I knew exactly what I wanted. And then there were moments of total, very humbly needing help.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of comics is, like, you can go when those situations where you have like the total clarity of what you want, you can put that in there. But then when you have somebody, like, when you don't exactly know what you want, but you have somebody like Andrew or Kyle to work with, there's such incredible artists that they can work off of pretty much anything. I mean, I'm sure you know about the history of comics and like Marvel style and things like that, but
totally.
I'm not definitely wouldn't say that you would work off of that, but I mean, there's no single way to skin a cat in comics, and there's like it makes sense. I mean, like, to work within one project and kind of just find the right fit for the right situation and be flexible in your scripting. I mean, not everybody's gonna be Alan Moore all the time, just like not everybody's gonna be Warren Ellis all the time. Right. So it makes sense. I wanted to ask about you're definitely trying to be as faithful to Brian's story as humanly possible, but obviously some of the things in the story, particularly Moxie, who I love, Epstein's assistant, that helps us better understand him as a person, and even I presume that Colonel Tom Parker is not literally the devil.
Who knows, right?
Exactly. But I mean, I presume that, I mean, those things are very loosely
No,
based
he's
on
not.
reality. But I'm
You're right.
curious, when it came to writing the Fifth Beatle, how did you balance historical accuracy and getting the right feel for certain moments?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm very heartened to hear you say that you think I did that, because that was something that was in my head the whole time, and really, I guess that's how I pulled it off, is by being very conscious of the need to do that.
Yeah.
You know, I've been researching Brian's story for 25 years, as we've discussed. So clearly, the facts are important to me, and I'm aware of the historical accuracy of things. But I'm sure, as is also apparent by this moment in the conversation, what I was mostly interested in is telling the poetry of the Brian Epstein story, telling the human side of his story. What was it like being a gay man at a time where it was against the law, and you had to keep your sexuality hidden, and yet you're pursuing a career path that puts you in the limelight? You know, every time he had a new achievement or accomplishment for the Beatles, he became more and more of a public figure, which meant that success equal danger for Brian, because the more successful he was for the Beatles, the more chance it was that his secret sexual identity would come out and he'd be thrown in jail.
Mm.
You know, what must that have been like? Because that, to me, was what was most inspiring. You know, so to me, I wanted to, yes, be true to the history, obviously, because facts are important, but really more importantly, and I really do think I can say more importantly as opposed to equally importantly, more importantly, but more just by a little bit, is the poetry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is getting into the artistic side of things. And quite frankly, why do a graphic novel? Why bring two artists on board if you're not going to get into poetry, right?
Right.
I mean, otherwise I could have written a prose biography. But I think, like, the whole point of this is being able to get into the poetry of things, and it was really just a matter of being conscious of that, of feeling that where I was taking some liberalities, that I was sacrificing some of the historical accuracy for the poetry in a way that was responsible. That at the end of the day, it might have just been a date change. Maybe the Beatles were actually in Manchester. They weren't in Tauntaun that weekend, you know, and maybe, you know, these two incidents happened a week apart in real life, and I made them happen at this, you know, the same moment in the graphic novel. Things that, you know, it's not that massive a change,
Mm-hmm.
but what it gets across poetically and emotionally is closer to how it felt.
Yeah.
You know, is that how it felt to Brian? Did it feel like these 10 things happened at the same time? And if I think it felt that way, then maybe it's okay to portray it that way. Because ultimately, the Fifth Beatle is really told through Brian's eyes. Right? So if it's told through Brian's eyes and it didn't quite happen that way, do I think, as his biographer, if I can be so arrogant as to say that I'm his biographer, you know, if it felt that way to him, then maybe I'm doing my job. You know, so just being conscious of walking the line, and being conscious of what I think, of how I think it felt to him. And if I was portraying it true to what I call emotional authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
then I felt I was doing my job as a graphic novelist. You know, if I was a prose biographer, that's a different job. I'm held to a different standard. But as a graphic novelist, I think it is your job to get into emotional authenticity.
And I think that's the perfect phrase for it, because, you know, a character like Moxie is perfect for revealing that. You know, she's a perfect foil for him, because she's like this beautiful young woman who clearly adores him. But in reality, it's more, she's like a tool to better understand what Brian's going through and who Brian is and everything like that. And I think that, you know, it works very well for that. But the one factual thing I have to ask about is, was Colonel Tom Parker ordering a breakfast buffet a legit thing? Because that man was a super beast, if that was the case. Because I would love to order a breakfast buffet for myself, but I love the juxtaposition of him ordering a breakfast buffet and Brian being like half of a grapefruit and tea.
Yeah. I mean, so look, I mean, Parker in that sequence is overblown in every way, shape, or form.
I know.
He's not exactly the devil, but we portray him as the devil. You know, he may not have ordered the entire buffet for himself, but he pretty much did. You know, I mean, he was a glutton. He was obese. I mean, he was he was all those things, in terms of emotional authenticity that we portray him as in that sequence. But the reality of the facts, it might be a little bit or a lot overblown. And actually, on the Parker note, I'll say that I've begun work on my next graphic novel project. And my next graphic novel project is actually going to be about Parker.
Oh, wow.
The tentative title is A Mess of Blues, the Colonel Parker and Elvis Presley story. And so I'm going to get into that, exactly that line that you're talking about right now, in greater detail, tread it with Parker. And I've been talking to I'm right now in discussions with a number of artists for that. And I readily say that, like, if you've seen how we portray Parker in the Fifth Beatle, that was a short, isolated sequence in which he appeared, and I wanted to get across how he felt to Brian, what Brian thought he was, which is why we portray him that way. But as I, get into, 120 some pages about Parker, because similarly, I do want to keep A Mess of Blues quite thin. I want to, it's clear how I feel about Parker. Like, I don't have a lot of respect for Parker the way I do for Brian. But part of our job in telling the Colonel Parker story is getting into the humanism of it, because he wasn't the devil incarnate. I don't believe any human being is, right? So why did he do those things? Was he driven by some incredible insecurity or arrogance or need to prove himself? Like, how did he get to that place? And through that, we'll really be able to learn a lot from his story. I have been sort of resisting telling Parker's story for a long time, because I don't respect the guy. And one of my fellow writer colleagues told me, as he was encouraging me to do this, he said, look, man, people have written a lot of books about Hitler, and that doesn't mean everybody who's written a book about Hitler and the Nazi regime is a fan of Hitler.
Yes,
and I was like, that's a really good point. And, similar to the Parker sequence in the Fifth Beatle, it might be an extreme example, but the point is well taken.
Yeah.
So that's what I hope we've done in that sequence. We've given you the extremes of Parker, but I hope that the points are well taken.
And I like the idea of you telling that story, just because he is such a fitting juxtaposition for everything Brian represented. And I do believe that you conveyed that very well, that everything was from Brian's perspective. So it's more about how, like, he was feeling in the situation. But yeah, anyways, that makes total sense. But I just have two more questions for you. And I wanted to ask about the paperback, because I have the hardcover. I love the hardcover. The hardcover is such an amazing production, and
Thank you.
It's a treasure of a book. But you just released the paperback, which is it's a slightly less expensive price. It's $14.99. It has a bunch of extra features to it.
Yeah,
it's kind of like the fully realized final version that's also maybe a little bit more accessible to a wider audience, because it's slightly more affordable price, I guess, even though the hardcover is $19.99, so it's not like crazy. But why did you decide that you wanted to release a paperback version, a few years after the initial release?
Yeah, so there is sort of some practical business reasons, which are, you just pointed out, it's a little bit cheaper. It might help us reach an even broader audience. And at this point, the book has very happily, reached a very wide audience. Mm-hmm. And, that part is just, publishing business 101. You release your Stephen King book in hardcover, and all the fans and everybody who loves Stephen King will purchase that. And several years later, it's like maybe the people who didn't rush out to read The Stand because it was so huge, and like, I'm not a massive Stephen King fan, they'll pick up the paperback and give it a shot,
Sure.
So we've kind of reached that place, so that's a pure business reason. However, the creative reason, which is significant, is that this is an expanded edition, and we're 3 years since the production of the original, the first release of the book in hardcover, and so much has happened since then. The introduction to the book was written by Billy J. Kramer, one of Brian's other artist clients. And the first line of Billy's introduction is, I'm baffled by the fact that Brian Epstein hasn't been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Well, a year after the Fifth Beatle came out in hardcover, Brian was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Oh. And the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame called me when they decided they were going to induct him. And to their infinite credit, they said, we know that Brian deserves to be inducted, so we're inducting him. But the truth is, we don't know much about him. And from reading your book, you seem like you're the expert. So would you help us? Would you work with us on this induction? and I was able to be a liaison to the family. The Epstein family is notoriously private, and they didn't want to come out to the induction ceremony. But through me, they submitted a letter that Peter Asher, who inducted Brian, read out at the ceremony, and I was very honored to be able to be the guy that made that happen. Mm-hmm. And there were a number of other elements of the rock and roll induction that I was able to work on. And so one of the expanded edition materials is an essay that I wrote called The Curtain Rising, about my experiences working with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on Brian Epstein's induction. And I think that's going to be incredibly fascinating to people. Mm-hmm. And it's really something we couldn't have done 3 years ago because it wasn't the case. Yeah. It was showing how much has changed, you know? And Kyle Baker, you know, his sequence in the book is very small, as we talked about earlier, and he did such brilliant work that has gone over so well. People have loved that sequence. So Kyle now has a memorabilia gallery, a sketchbook gallery of other Beatles cartoons and sequences that he was working on as he was gearing up to do his sequence. So now there's a little bit more material from Kyle, and that's just something we didn't have back then. And, you know, so there's a number, and I did a TED Talk called The Fifth Beatle and Impossible Dreams. And the TED Talk, I'm self-aware enough to know that I was offered a TED Talk because of my success with the book, you know? Mm-hmm. And so we transcribed the TED Talk and put it into the expanded edition. And that was literally something that I hadn't done and hadn't given when the hardcover came out. So really, like, why now? The large part of the reason, apart from all the business reasons of putting out a paperback, is just that there is expanded edition material that didn't exist. Mm-hmm. Before, or material that there wasn't interested in, that there might not have been that interest in. You know, Andrew Robinson has a wonderful, 20-page section in the expanded edition of his early sketches and his character designs and his process and learning how he painted those pages. And obviously that stuff existed 3 years ago, but the Fifth Beatle was a crapshoot. We weren't sure if anybody was going to be interested in a comic book about a rock and roll manager. Mm-hmm. We believed in our work, but who knew, right?
Right.
And so now that we know that there are so many fans out there, and Andrew's work, Andrew won the Reuben Award, the highest award a cartoonist can win for his work on the Fifth Beatle. So now we know people are interested in Andrew's work in the Fifth Beatle. So let's share his memorabilia gallery. I know this is going to sound awfully self-serving, but I think the expanded material in the Fifth Beatle, there's literally about 35 pages of new material between Andrew's art, Kyle's art, and my essays. And I think, for people who are fans, it's really rich material. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel like tack on stuff. And as a fanboy and a huge comic fan, again, this is going to sound self-serving, but I often feel that when some of these big companies, Marvel and DC, and I do love Marvel and DC, so I don't mean this as a total criticism, but very often you'll see a very famous graphic novel get re-released for some anniversary, and it's got some quote-unquote new material in the back, and you shell out the extra money because you're a fan, and you flip through the new material, and it's really not that exciting. Right. It's really not that much. It's just like you get the impression that they dug into the archives, they dug up a few things, they shoved it in there just so that they could release a 25th anniversary and make a few bucks out of the fans. Like, I think that we have not done that. I think this new edition really feels like something that's not just gouging some extra money off of the fans. And by the way, it's also pretty cheap, so it's not even that much money. But it really is some new and rich material that simply didn't exist, 3 years ago when the book came out.
It's your Criterion collection.
And that's a very humbling thing to hear you say, but that's the kind of thing we were going for here. Yeah. Something that really is not just bonus materials, but is bonus materials with an eye to history.
Yeah,
with an eye to what has happened in the past 3 years, and how can the Fifth Beatle expanded edition, look back on the past 3 years with something that can be learned from. Another great example is Howard Cruz, the pioneering LGBT cartoonist who wrote Stuck Rubber Baby. He wrote an essay at the end of the Fifth Beatle 3 years ago called The Freedom to Marry, and talking about the situation with homosexuality being against the law in Brian's day and age, and how 3 years ago in America we were fighting for the freedom to marry, and how how much that would have meant to Brian.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, subsequent to the book's release, the Supreme Court ratified the freedom to marry.
Mm-hmm.
And so Howard Cruz wrote a new essay for our expanded edition that talks about all the changes that gay rights have achieved in the 3 years since the Fifth Beatle was released, and how much is still left to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe now it's not the freedom to marry that we should be fighting for, but it's a wonderful organization called Freedom for All Americans. Mm-hmm. And that's literally something that looks back on the past 3 years since the first edition came out and shows how the Fifth Beatle is part of a newer fight to push forward.
Yeah. So the last question I have for you is related to business, because you went to the Wharton School, and for people who don't know that, it's arguably, or maybe even inarguably, the best business school in the world. And, perhaps related to that, the Fifth Beatle was a New York Times best-selling book. And from afar, one of the things I've been really impressed by you, Vivek, is just as somebody who pays attention to the industry, you are incredible at getting stuff out there, about getting reach with your promotion and everything like that. And it's very impressive. When it came to finding the right audience for this book, what was your approach?
We talked about this a little bit earlier. The first thing I wanted to do was keep the graphic novel short, mm-hmm. So that it didn't feel terribly intimidating to pick up. So somebody who was a huge Beatles fan, but maybe not a comic book fan, could pick it up, flip through it, and be like, okay, it's not that expensive and it's not that long. I'll give this a shot. And similarly, maybe a comic book fan who wasn't a huge Beatles fan or wasn't a huge music fan might think, oh, you look at Andrew Robinson and Kyle Baker worked on this. They're amazing comic artists. This art is beautiful. I might not be interested in the Brian Epstein story so much, but let's give it a shot. It's not that long. And also really, as I was writing it from just a script-oriented standpoint, to keep in mind that the story I was really telling, on the surface, it might be the Beatles' origin story, to use a comic book phrase, mm-hmm. But really underneath that, it's a human story. It's an inspiring human story. We talked earlier about some film comparables. It's Rocky, it's Billy Elliot. That's what this is. It's the least likely guy to succeed, going the distance in their chosen field. And I kept thinking, if you took the word Beatles out of it, and if you took the Beatles out of it as their likenesses and had some random band, would the story still be compelling? Obviously, it would be harder to market, but would it still be compelling? And if the scene that I wrote wouldn't be so compelling if the word Beatles and John Lennon were replaced with some random band name and some random Zach, if that scene didn't hold its own without being about the Beatles, then I needed to rewrite that scene, mm-hmm. And accordingly, when the book was done, obviously, we wanted to make sure we did something that would appeal to the comic book fans and the Beatles fans. And I'm a huge comic fan. I'm a huge Beatles fan. So that they were our first responders, so to speak, the people that were immediately excited. But we really wanted to make sure that we reached out to the LGBTQ community. We reached out to the Jewish community. We reached out to libraries. We reached out to young people who are defining their careers, students, who might feel that they have unorthodox dreams, people for whose stories we believed that the Brian Epstein story would have a lot of resonance, but might not be an immediately obvious target audience.
Right.
And by reaching out to those folks and giving them something that we thought would be accessible, easy to consume, and affordable, we really hoped that we would immediately, make some waves and have something special on our hands. And that was our strategy in those early days.
I think you accomplished it very well. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about the Fifth Beatle with me. I love the book. It's amazing. And the new paperback, I'm going to have to check out too, because all the bonus materials sound wonderful. But thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Thank
you so much. It was really a joy to speak with you. As I'm sure you can tell, I love to talk, and this is a labor of love. So I'll talk about it all evening if you keep me at it. So I really do appreciate it.
You have a lot of passion for the subject, and that comes across, and that, it's important. I don't think the comic would have been nearly as good without it.
Well, thank you. That's a very, very kind thing to say. I was just going to say, if I've learned anything from Brian Epstein, it's also that you need to promote your projects at every opportunity you can. So, at the risk of sounding like I'm shamelessly self-promoting, if anyone in the audience is interested in learning more about the television show or getting breaking news, I do expect that we'll be announcing our director, our cast, and our network within the next handful of months. So please follow us for breaking news on Twitter at Fifth Beatle. We're also on Facebook. And we have a mailing list that you can sign up for at our website, which is fifthbeatle.com. And my projects, you can learn more about me and my projects at tiwaryent.com. And I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. My Twitter handle is at Vivek J. Tiwary. That's VIVEK JTIWARY. And I would love to keep in touch with anyone who's a fan or even who's remotely intrigued by what I'm doing. So please do stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thanks, Vivek.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with the writer of The Fifth Beatle, Vivek Tiwary. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating and review while you're at it. Also, my comics adjacent newsletter called The Crossover is in the middle of its first season. Make sure to subscribe at bit.ly/the crossover newsletter if you want more writing from me. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in later this week for a new episode.